Welcome to the Sermon Podcast for First Baptist North Zulch. Our church exists to reach people right where they are, help them know God, and follow Him with all that they are. We hope that you enjoy today's message. For more information, please follow us online at fbcnz.org.
Well, if you have your Bibles with you, open up to the book of Daniel, chapter 6. Daniel, chapter 6. If you haven't been with us, we've been studying through the book of Daniel the last several weeks, and we are after today, we'll be halfway there. So we're slowly but surely working our way through, and it's been a series called In the Fire, and we've just been walking chapter by chapter, kind of verse by verse, looking at these different themes and different stories, and we've been looking at the book of Daniel through this lens of this entire idea that all of God's story, all of God's Bible itself is actually history unfolding itself. And we're looking at this story of Daniel through the lens of God writing His story through history. History is His story, and this amazing story of God's love and God's redemption and God's mercy and God's rule and God's reign. And we've been covering a lot of ground. Like I said, we've covered the first 5 chapters so far. I don't know about you, church, if you've been with us through the series, but it's been I've really enjoyed the study, the time of just really breaking down the book of Daniel and really diving in deep. And there are certain stories in the Bible that are so familiar to us that we can hear maybe just part of the title, and we know the rest of it, right? So let's just do a little game together, a little opening game, if you're okay with that. Even if you're not, we're going to do it either way. So we're going to do a little activity. Let's start with the Old Testament, just go through some different stories. I'll say the first part. I want you to complete the sentence, okay? So Noah and the ark, good. Joseph and the coat of many colors. Yeah, that was what I was looking for there. So I know it was maybe a little tricky. Okay, Joseph and Mary. Some of you said Mary. Okay. Old Testament, though. Old Testament. Moses crossing Red Sea, right? Okay. David and Goliath. There you go. Jonah and the whale. All right, let's go. Let's show the New Testament some love here. New Testament, here we go. Peter walks on water. Okay. Momentarily, but he still gets credit for it, right? The woman at the well. Good job. The day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost. Remember the Spirit indwelling, Acts chapter 2 there. Acts chapter 1, chapter 2. Paul on the road to Damascus. All right, this one's a little tricky. So Jesus heals. That's like, which one, right? Jesus heals a lot of people. So maybe the lame, the blind, the dead. I mean, that was a trick question, by the way. You all passed. Good job. Let's go back to the Old Testament here, though. Let me just say this. Daniel and the lion's den. Now, isn't it strange that of all the stories in Daniel that we've already covered in the first 5 chapters, when we think of the book of Daniel, that's what we think of most. Daniel and the lion's den. The book of Daniel, by the way, is 12 chapters long. But the one thing that kind of summarizes the book of Daniel is at least a lot of times that we think of is Daniel and the lion's den. It's kind of interesting to me that is like the highlight of the book, but the book has so much more into it. The stories, the events, the power shift, if you will. There's lots of different themes happening in the book of Daniel, but Daniel and the lion's den kind of is the headliner if we were to just summarize it in a sentence, right? Well, last week we looked at chapter 5, and we saw a guy named Belshazzar, who was the newly acquired king, a co-heir king with his dad, Nabonidus, and they were there, and they were ruling. And remember, Belshazzar was a guy who was prideful and arrogant, and kind of had his head in the sand, thinking it was all about him. And it was through a long series of events that actually God showed up through the hand writing on the wall, and writing the writing was on the wall that the kingdom was going to fall. The kingdom of Babylon was going to come crashing down because of their pride and arrogance. And it was at the hands of the Medo-Persian army and a guy named King Darius, who shows up at the age of 62, conquers Babylon, and Babylon is no longer a thing. That was chapter 5. Today we're in chapter 6, and it's Daniel and the lion's den. So we're gonna kind of get to this highlight passage of the book of Daniel today, and we're going to look at this very, very familiar story. I'm sure that many of you have heard this story before, read it at some point in your life, or heard some rendition of it. But my prayer today is that we would all view this in a new, fresh way, that we would see something different would stand out to us today. So let's just jump in. Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. And it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. And over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps would give an account, so the king might suffer no loss. Now, we're just going to kind of do this. We're just going to work through the text. We're going to break it down, stop, and then just kind of break some things apart here. But the first thing we see right here in the first couple of verses is that this guy, King Darius, he's new on the scene. And one of the very first things that he does is he changes the governmental system of the empire. Remember, Babylon, the great Babylon, has just fallen. Babylon was this kingdom that spared no expense to put everything on display. They boasted in all of their riches and all of their glory and all of their fame and their power and their might. But Babylon itself they adopted the way of monarchy. There was always one main ruler who ruled the throne, who had the iron fist, who was going to do things their way. And there was one key ruler. They had a monarch in Babylon. Now, actually, monarchy is actually God's greatest plan. It's God's desire that monarchy is the way in which something were to be run. Now, let me just say this. Let me give a little caveat here, because here's the thing. The best way that God sees fit for organization to run is with monarchy. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. Because Jesus is the monarch. He is the one. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, the Most High, the Most Holy. And one day He will return in all of His power. The whole world, every single person, every single being will bow and worship that Jesus is Lord. Now here's the problem. Man thinks they can run with the power of monarchy. And this form of government. The problem is man is sinful. And so you put a man in a power position like that, just like we saw Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, all these kings, and they were in those positions of power. They all fell because they were full of pride and arrogance, and they boasted, and they were sinful men. And man is imperfect, but one day Jesus will show us how that's actually supposed to look. But until then, He leaves us to figure it out on our own. So here's King Darius. He shows up. He changes things. Says, I don't like the monarchy system. We're going to set this up a little differently. So King Darius shows up. He gets 120 satraps. Now, we don't use that word. We don't really exactly know what that means. And some translations use the word governors or princes. But a satrap is actually someone who would have protected the kingdom. 120 people in place to help protect the kingdom. And over those 120, it says here in these first 2 verses that he put 3 presidents, is what this ESV says. Different translations use words like commissioners, administrators. 3 who were above the 120. So you've got Darius, who's the king. You've got these 120, but of the 120, there's also 3 more who rule the 120. So it's this weird system of leadership and government that we kind of see taking place here. But what these 3 men are placed to do is to guard against corruption and the mishandling of the kingdom. So he's delegating responsibility. Darius is putting these different men in place. And the Bible says that Daniel is one of the 3. Daniel is one of the 3. And at this point in his life, he's about 80. He's in his 80s, and he's still going strong. He's like, I'm not just going to sit back in the recliner and just watch TV all day and just take it easy. I'm going strong. I'm there. I'm living my life. I am working in the kingdom. I'm one of the 3. Because he's got this leadership that God's given him. He's got this role, and God's given him this role in the kingdom. He's continued to do this all throughout the book of Daniel. Put Daniel in positions of leadership. But what I want to do is I want to draw out 4 things, 4 characteristics about Daniel's life that I want to unpack here through chapter 6 of Daniel. And the first is this, that Daniel was a man of character. So he's one of the 3 of the 120. Now watch this in verse 3. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Daniel's distinguished himself above everybody else. He's in this position of power. He has this authority that God's given him, this position of leadership above all the other officials. Darius takes this particular liking to this guy named Daniel, who's in his 80s. And he makes him the highest of these 3 officials, these 3 presidents, as it says here. Why? Because he was a man of character. He was a man of character. Now, in today's world, I was thinking about that. In today's world, people aren't always given promotions in today's culture based on what they know or how skilled they are or even who they are. Sometimes today, people are given promotions because of what? Who they know. You've always heard that, right? It's about who you know makes all the difference. Who you know can get you promoted in a company or can get you up the ladder quicker because you might know the right person. And I was thinking about that very thing this week. And I'm a sports guy. I love sports. And the most relevant example I could think about that's just really current is the NBA draft just happened a couple of weeks ago. And you may not know the first thing about NBA. You may not care. This is the National Basketball Association. You may not care one bit. But I like basketball. There are 2 rounds in the NBA draft, of which there are 58 total picks. So 58 picks of these men who are across the whole world who are available for the NBA teams to draft. In this year's draft, we saw this whole idea of who you know taking shape because there was a guy by the name of Bronny James. Bronny James, drafted 55th overall in the second round by the Los Angeles Lakers. By the way, his dad, LeBron James, plays for the Lakers. So in the second round of the NBA draft, 55th overall, Bronny James. Now listen, this is not about who you know, or this is not about how good you are or your statistics. This is about who you know, because let me share with you some statistics about Bronny James. Now I'm not trying to hate on the man. I'm just saying who you know sometimes makes all the difference, because this is the National Basketball Association. You have to put like the proof's in the pudding kind of thing, right? Well, in 1 year at USC, the University of Southern California, let me just share with you Bronny James' statistics. 1 year, he averaged 4.8 points, 2.8 rebounds, 2.1 assists, 0.8 steals in 19 minutes across 25 games, of which he started 6. He shot 36% overall from the entire field, 26% behind the three-point line, and 67% from the free throw line. Listen, these numbers might not mean anything to you, but let me just tell you, they are subpar. 55th overall, LeBron James, his son, Bronny James, is selected by the Los Angeles Lakers. I'm like, talk about pressure. But there he is, and I'm thinking, as I watch it, I'm thinking, there is no way that he is the 55th best player overall out of the entire world. But his dad's on the team. And a lot of people say LeBron James is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. I would disagree with that, but we'll have that conversation a different day. But here's the thing about it. It's all about who he knew. Now, for Daniel's position in his life in this moment, this was not the case. Remember, Daniel was one of the exiles, one of the 4 young Jewish men who was brought over and who was, very beginning of Daniel chapter 1, he's one of the 4 guys who kind of goes through the king's training program. He's not anybody who's just super special. He doesn't know people. He has had positions of power, but for Daniel, his life was marked by character. It was marked by not who he knew, but who he was. The lifestyle at which he lived. And God saw fit for Daniel, because of his character, to move in the heart of King Darius, to put him in this position of power over the kingdom. It says here in the text that he had an excellent spirit was in him. No doubt God's favor was all over Daniel's life. And we've seen this playing out through the book of Daniel so far. King Nebuchadnezzar saw it. Remember back in chapter 5 when the queen showed up and the queen saw it? The queen called out to Belshazzar, hey, listen, this guy has an excellent spirit in him. There's something different about him. Belshazzar saw the Spirit of God in Daniel. He saw something different as he interpreted the handwriting on the wall that nobody else could interpret. And now, obviously, King Darius is noticing this too. But listen, the word excellent here that's used here is actually this word yatir. And this word yatir is an Aramaic adjective designating something as excellent, outstanding, or superior. He had a superior spirit about him, an excellent spirit about him, an outstanding spirit about him, because he was a man of character, because he knew the one true God. He knew the one true God. Horace Greeley, American journalist, actually the one who founded the New York Times, wrote this about this idea of character. He said, fame is a vapor. Popularity an accident, riches take wings. Those who cheer today may curse tomorrow, but only one thing endures: character. Character. Character matters. Daniel was a man of character, first of all. Second of all, Daniel was a man of consistency. Daniel was a man of consistency. Look at verse 4. Then the presidents and the satraps, watch this, they sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. So let's get this straight. King Darius promotes Daniel. He's a man of character. He's proven himself. There's something different about him. He's got this excellent spirit. So he gets promoted. All of a sudden, the other presidents and satraps get word of this. And they're a little ticked. They're a little jealous. They're a little envious. So what do? They seek to find some ground of error within him because of their jealousy. Have you ever found somebody that's like that? It's just jealous. They just can't handle it when somebody else gets it and they don't. Kind of saw that a little bit this week with my daughters, with one having a birthday and one not. There's a little jealousy there sometimes, right? Sometimes the jealousy comes out a little bit. But they're seeking here to find ground for complaint, and they begin to examine his work. They're not so much looking at his personal life, they're looking at his work life, his professional life. It says here that they searched for a complaint with regard to the kingdom. His governmental work. Let's look at his work ethic. Let's look at his track record. Let's look at his resume and all the things that he's done. And let's really examine his governmental work to see if there's a character flaw that we can charge him with or some error or mishap along the way. And listen, they're unsuccessful. Why? Because he was consistent, once again, in his character. He was consistent in his character. I love what how the NASB reads this. I'm preaching out of the ESV, as I always do, but I love the NASB translation. If you have that Bible, it might read a little differently. It would say something like this. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption because he was trustworthy. And no negligence or corruption was to be found with him. I just want to pull out three of those words that the NASB uses. The word trustworthy. He was trustworthy. He handled his duties in a faithful manner. He was a trustworthy employee. Sometimes those are hard to come by these days. But he was trustworthy. It says that there was no negligence. Webster's define negligence as a habitual omission of something that ought to be done, either from carelessness or design. There was no negligence. But also there was no corruption. Webster's defines corruption as the perversion or the deterioration of moral principles, loss of purity or integrity. He had neither one, no corruption and no negligence. He was spot on, clean, and all that he did. He was a great employee. His work was great. And listen, under that critical microscope looking for error, these satraps and government officials, they could find nothing against Daniel. There's no blemish there. So what do they do? Verse 5, then these men said, well, we shall not find any ground for a complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So they shift from his professional life to his religious life. Let's find this area with him and his God. Notice what's happening. They're making this shift. They're really taking this to this really deep personal level of his life, trying to look at his religious life and his beliefs and his belief system with God. They hoped they could find something to trip him up and disqualify him. And that evidently they knew that Daniel worshipped the monotheistic God, the one God alone. You know, and all this time, idolatry was just everywhere, but Daniel's like, my faith is in God alone. And they're like, let's use his own faith in his one God against him. Let's turn the tables on him. Let's trip him up because of his consistency to his one God. And if he refuses to not worship any other gods, then let's use that to trip him up and to make him fall. So verse 6, then these high officials and satraps, they came by agreement to the king, and they said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, the governors agree that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any other god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish this injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Verse 9, therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. They came up with this plan. If we can't find any other blemish in his record, let's use his own strength against him and let's trip him up. And they say, listen, king, all the government leaders have made this agreement. By the way, did they all? No, because Daniel wasn't in the conversation. He's the guy who's left out of the conversation. They're lying in front of the king to try to make Daniel look bad. They're lying in front of the king. This is what they're saying, that everybody's in agreement, and if anybody refuses, let's throw them into the lion's den. And they were eagerly, you have to imagine they were eagerly encouraging this king to sign the decree. I was thinking about that too this week. And I was just like, man, I remember when we bought our first house. Now, if you've been if you bought a house before, you know that process can be grueling, it can be taxing, it can be a very just tiring process. You know, not just the shopping and the searching and the looking, but the actual signing of the papers. And we're there, and here we are, first-time home buyers, and we're sitting down, and we're there. And you know, if you've ever been in that situation, they put this 6-inch binder full of documents in front of you. They say, all right, get your pen and paper out, let's start signing stuff away. And I'm like, now listen, by the way, nobody reads that. Nobody reads that. We'd be there for months if we're trying to read everything. But basically what we're doing is we're sitting here, and we're looking at our realtor, and she's going, this is okay, this is what this means, and here's the title processor, and we're all working together. They're kind of giving us the cues. Yes, page 3 just kind of says this. Okay, sign here. What do we do? Sign there. Next page. Okay, this next page kind of says this kind of thing. Okay, sign there. You're not reading the whole thing. I picture that's kind of what this is like. They're pushing the document in front of the king. They're saying, hey, king, let's just make this little injunction. Just sign your name right here. And don't worry about it. We've got this covered. We're covering. We're leading the kingdom for you. We're helping you out. And he's like, all right, it sounds good. He signs off, right? And next thing you know, all of a sudden, this idea shifts. Now, here's the problem. As it says in verse 8, this decree, once it was signed, it could not be changed or revoked. Like the king signed it, as according to our law, the Medes and the Persians, it cannot be revoked. And this is where we see Daniel's third quality. He was a man of conviction. Daniel was a man of conviction. How do we know that? Look at verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he got word these guys were up to something. When he knew the document had been signed, what did he do? He went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed, and he gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. This is an incredible response, by the way, to a death warrant of being thrown into a den of lions. Daniel's just like, sounds fine. I'm going to keep doing what I always do. I'm a man of conviction. I'm not going to change my conviction based on my circumstance. I'm going to continue to be who I am. And Daniel knew the document had been signed. It says when he knew the document had been signed, he kept doing what he always did. And I love what it says. Not only did he keep doing what he'd always done, but it says here that he goes to his house. Notice, the upper chamber, the upstairs room in his house, and he just starts praying super quietly so nobody can hear him, right? No. It says he opens the windows. He says, not only am I a man of conviction, but I don't care who knows and who hears. I'm not afraid of any of them. He opens the windows and he begins to pray towards Jerusalem, just like he had always done 3 times a day, because he was a man of conviction. I don't care who hears me. I don't care who sees me. I'm not going to change at the face of a threat from these men. Verse 11, then these men came by agreement, and they found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. And they came near, and they said to the king, before the king, concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den? And the king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you've signed, but he makes his petition 3 times a day. I mean, Daniel's just not just ignoring us, but he's rubbing it in your face, king. 3 times a day, he's continuing to cry out to his God. And you can almost picture these men like little children spying on Daniel around the corner, just waiting for him to go tattle to the king. Because you, O king, didn't you say this, O king? We got this guy, Daniel, O king. And there's all this childlike behavior from these men, reporting it to king. And they're saying, listen, you got to do something, king. And you know the law. You signed it. Verse 14, then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. He's thinking, how do we get out of this thing? And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. See, King Darius didn't share the same excitement that these guys shared about this. And he wasn't upset with Daniel for praying. Perhaps he was actually upset in that moment because he realized the trap that they had laid for him as well. That this was not a law to honor the king. This was a law to trip up Daniel. And he's just heartbroken. He's like, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. He labored until the sun went down, it says. This wasn't a law to honor the king. This was a law to eliminate a threat because they were jealous and they were bloodthirsty. And they say, Daniel has to go into the lions' den. Verse 16, then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. I don't think that was a sarcastic comment to him. I think that was a very heartfelt, like, I hope you survive this, man, because I like you a lot. And the stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king, watch this, verse 18, he went to his palace and he spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled him. Then, at daybreak, the king arose and he went in haste to the den of lions. You can see his concern for Daniel. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out with a tone of anguish. And the king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to deliver you from the lion's den? And he's just waiting. Just please give me something. Give me something. And this is where we see Daniel's fourth characteristic trait, is that Daniel was a man of confidence. He was a man of confidence. Then Daniel says to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouth of lions, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Daniel was a man of confidence. Now I love the fact that Daniel's confidence was not in himself. His confidence was fully rooted in who God was. It says in verse 22, my God sent his angel. My God sent his angel. My confidence is in God and God alone. And he continued to display this all throughout his life. Every threat, every opportunity that he had to denounce his faith, he kept his confidence fully rooted in who God was. In chapter 1, he said, I will resolve with myself not to eat the king's food because my confidence is in God. I'm not afraid of you, Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 2, he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's first dream. He calls him out. He says, yeah, you think you're this great statue, but you're going to fall one day, because my confidence is God. I'm not afraid of you. In chapter 4, he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's second dream. He says, listen, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm trying to warn you. You will fall. You are too prideful. I'm not afraid of you because my confidence is in God. In chapter 5, he interprets Belshazzar's dream. He says, listen, you're prideful. You're arrogant. I'm trying to warn you. My confidence is God. I'm not afraid of you. And here in chapter 6, he says the same thing. I'm not afraid of the lion's den because my confidence is in my God. Not myself. You can threaten me. You can even throw me in the den. But my God sent his angel, and no harm was done to him. You can see it here in verse 23. It says that they brought him out, and they began to examine him, but no harm was found on him. They're looking for a scratch, a bite, a bruise, something. There's nothing. He's spotless. Just like when he went in, he came out the same way. Because he didn't just talk about his faith. He lived it out. He didn't just talk about his confidence in God. He put his full trust in God. Let me just say this, church, that a living faith in a living God will give you courage and strength to face every emergency in life. A living faith in a living God will give you the strength and the courage to face any emergency in life, even being thrown into a pit with hungry lions. My faith is in my God, and my confidence is in my God, not myself. Daniel proved in this text that he was a man of character, consistency, conviction, and confidence. You know what all four of those words, other than the fact that they all start with C in a very Baptist way, right? They all have in common. They all lead to one point. This one word called integrity. Ultimately, all those things that Daniel displayed in his life was a life of integrity. He was a man of integrity before his God. He lived his life with character, consistency, conviction, and confidence because He had integrity. Now, integrity is defined by dictionary.com, gives a couple different definitions, and the first one says this: adherence to moral and ethical principles, soundness of moral character and honesty. The second definition says the state of being whole, entire, or undiminished. This is who Daniel was. He was a man of integrity. This word integrity has a Latin root, this word integer, which means entire or whole or complete. It's the same word that's used in the math world. If you're a math whiz, that's that word. It's an integer. It's not a decimal, not a fraction. It's a whole number. It's a full number. In other words, for Daniel in his life, there was no discrepancy between this person of integrity that he appeared to be on the outside and who he was on the inside. What you see is what you get kind of thing. He was whole, he was consistent, the same through and through, and that's who Daniel was. And listen, for us as believers, if you're a Christ follower today, this is what our life of integrity should look like. It should be this congruence between our character and our creed, between our beliefs and our behavior. We shouldn't say one thing and do another. We should be what we say we are. That's what integrity is. It means loving God with the totality of who you are. Not just giving God a little portion of your week on Sunday and then living like the world the rest of the week. Not just giving God 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there, but saying, God, I'm all yours. Because my life is full of integrity and I want to live for you. I want you, the totality of my life, all of who I am. And I'm going to allow you, through my faith, to work in my life. The wholeness, the fullness of my life. And that means in my family, in my community, in my relationships, in my career, in every aspect of my life, God, you are at the center of it all. And we've been seeing this theme all through the book of Daniel. And it kind of comes to this head here at the end of chapter 6, where it's all about Daniel being a man of integrity. You know, we just recreated our vision statement this last year and just kind of put this new vision out. And this is part of it, that we want people to know God and to follow Him with all that they are. Follow Him with integrity, with all that you are, with the wholeness, the fullness of your life. This is who Daniel was, and this is who we ought to strive to be as well. People of integrity who live our lives for the world to see. Now listen, there's 4 lessons about integrity I want to wrap up with as we get to close this morning. 4 lessons from integrity that we can learn from Daniel. This man, once again, in his 80s, who stood in the face of these evil, wicked kings and these people who were after him and trying to trip him up and was thrown into the lion's den. What can we learn about integrity from Daniel's life? First of all, living a life of integrity will always be visible to people around you. Living a life of integrity is always going to be visible to the people around us. I mean, think about this. This is how Daniel got his power, this job of power in the first place, because he said he was distinguished. He distinguished himself. He stood out from everybody else. There was something different about him. Darius noticed his life. There's something different about that Daniel character. Day in and day out, all of Daniel's life for 80 years. I mean, remember, they went into Babylon as exiles, as young teenage boys, and day in and day out, his life of integrity was always on display for everyone around him to see. Think back to what they said about him in verse 5. In chapter 6, verse 5. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." By the way, what a compliment. They didn't mean it like that, but that's a compliment. We can't find any other thing wrong with Daniel except for the fact that he's too devoted to his God. Wouldn't that be great to be said about you and me? The only flaw I see in that person is they spend too much time in prayer. They're too holy. They're too much like Jesus. By the way, label me that way all day long. I'll take it. That's the criticism. I'll take it, right? That's what they're saying here. We can't find anything else wrong with him other than we're going to find out the connection of his God, his faith in his God. I mean, wouldn't that be great if everyone around us could see that about us, that all they would see is Jesus? Don't see me, see Jesus. Don't see me, see Jesus. Look, it's not about me, it's about Jesus. A life of integrity is always visible to those around us. So let me just ask you this today, church. How well does your integrity show in your life? Do people around you know that? Or is it mixed signals? It's like the radio when you got the static. Like I kind of hear 3 different songs at one time. Isn't that the most annoying thing, by the way? You're listening to one song, then it changes here, and you're like, I don't know which one to follow. It's confusing. Is it clear? Is it full of integrity to God, or is it a little misleading? Secondly, living a life with integrity does not shield you from the unfairnesses of life. Just because you submit to God and live for God doesn't mean that your life is just going to be roses. Daniel wasn't thrown into the lion's den. Let's remember, he wasn't thrown into the lion's den for doing something wrong. He was doing everything right. And into the lion's den he still went. Daniel was punished for the crime of praying to his God in the privacy of his own home and the convictions of his own heart. And I'm sure we could look at that story. We said, that's just not right, man. This guy set him up and this is unfair. But living a life of integrity doesn't shield us from the unfairnesses of life. A lot of people in the Christian faith as well, they think if my life is out of control, is spiraling out of control and bad things are happening, I must be doing something wrong. Listen, when you're doing things right for God, the world takes notice and your bullseye gets bigger. And the enemy doesn't like it. He throws everything he can at you. So if your life is full of tragedy and sorrow and heartache and things like that, maybe you're doing everything right. And that's a good marker. Listen, here's the story I read. This was last year, but I read the story this week of a Christian woman who was arrested. Watch this. She was arrested by 6 police. I'm going, how big was that woman? 6 police. That's crazy. They put 6 police officers on her. What was she doing? She was must have been robbing the bank and threatening everybody. No, she was doing? She was outside of an abortion clinic privately praying to her God. 6 police officers detain her and arrest her because she was praying outside of an abortion clinic for God to do something miraculous. It's sickening. It's saddening. It's maddening at times. And here's the crazy thing. This was the 2nd time she was arrested for the very same thing. A year previously, she stood before a court system and they said she's not guilty of the same exact crime. Now here she was being the same thing, finding herself in the same situation. It's just unfair, but she was doing everything right. Jesus says like this in John chapter 16, verse 33. I've said these things to you that you may have peace. In this world you're going to have tribulation, but take heart because I've overcome the world. And when tribulation shows up, maybe that's a sign that you're doing something right. You're on the right track. Now sometimes there are just consequences in life and things happen and there's going to be, if you just decide to get in your truck today and just go down the highway at 150 miles an hour, there's going to be consequences and you're going to face that. You're like, well, I must have been doing everything right. No, you weren't. That's called speeding, okay? So there's that for you. But if you're finding yourself in this tragedy and this heartache, man, it's not going to unshield you. Living a life of integrity doesn't shield you. Here's what David said in Psalm 37. Fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord. That's the key right there. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He'll give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him, and He will act. Did you see the theme there? It's trusting in God. Trusting in the Lord, even in the midst of the unfair situations of life. Number 3, living a life of integrity begins with making a prayer a priority. What was Daniel doing in verse 10 when they showed up after the document had been signed? He's there in his house and he's praying. He's praying. He's in his upper room. He's praying with the windows open on his knees, praying before God. 3 times a day was his habit all throughout his life. I'm going to pray to God. I'm going to pray to God. I'm going to keep praying for God. And also notice the position at which he was in when he was praying. It's not a prerequisite for prayer, but it says that he was on his knees before God praying. Now, I don't know about you, but part of being on your knees, if it's like it's just uncomfortable sometimes. But I think that's how it's supposed to be sometimes. We're before God, and it's a symbolic posture before God, saying, I'm humbling myself before a holy God. I'm in an uncomfortable position because I'm humbling myself before God. I think the problem with our prayer life is sometimes we pray too comfortably. You ever find yourself like in the recliner? I'll raise both of my hands on this one because like you're in the recliner, you're kicked back, you're like, all right, God, let's have a word. You start praying, you close your eyes, next thing you know, God's like, hey, where'd you go, buddy? I'm like, Oh, yeah. Back to that. Anyways. Or you're in bed trying to pray and you fall asleep. Like, we get too comfortable in our prayers. In our actual physical posture. Man, Daniel's on his knees. And he's praying before God. And when we face the unfairnesses of life, here's kind of the three things that happen. Either, first of all, we panic, or we're paralyzed, or we pray. And here's the thing. When we panic in a situation of facing the uncertainties or the unfaithfulness, the unfairness of life, when we panic, we do the wrong thing. When we're paralyzed, we don't do anything. But when we pray, we do the right thing. And so we have to understand living a life of integrity begins with prayer. Jim Elliot says it like this. He's the great missionary martyr that gave his life for the cause. He says, God is still on his throne and man is still on his footstool, and there's only a knee's distance between. Fourth thing about Daniel that we learned through his life of a life of integrity. Living a life of integrity, here it is, it points others to the living God. Daniel's reputation as a man of integrity had given him the opportunity. Notice this, as we read about his life, and we've read this so far, it's given him the opportunity to impact two great, powerful kingdoms. The Babylonian kingdom and the Persian kingdom. His life of integrity gave him a platform to have leverage in sharing the gospel. And he changed the course of history. Look at the king's proclamation after finding Daniel. Remember, he throws him into the lion's den. He has to do it. He signed the document. He seals it up. He goes home. He loses sleep. He can't stop thinking about it. He shows up the next day. Daniel, are you in there? Are you okay? He shows up. He gets out. He examines them. Everything is fine. And here's what the king says in verse 24. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought in. What's the king do? He's ticked, man. And he cast them into the lion's den. Them, their children, their wives. And before they reached the bottom, the lions overpowered them and broke all of their bones into pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to an end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered through the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And here's this pagan king who sees this amazing act of God, and he does nothing more than to praise God and say, everybody has the freedom to worship this living God. I'm making a decree that this living God, his kingdom endures forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. Now, most scholars don't really actually know that or would confirm that he actually puts his full faith in Jesus and changes his life. But he makes some statements here that are powerful. And it just makes us wonder. Daniel, this man in his 80s, living for God, living with integrity, on display, not afraid to put himself in harm's way, and living it for others to see how much he was used for God. It just makes us wonder, how could God use our integrity today? What kind of impact could we have on this world if we would consistently live out our faith and follow God every day? How would it change our workplace, our family, our neighborhood, our friend groups, whatever it looks like? How would our lives change if we modeled this kind of integrity? And we strive to live our lives with integrity. When we do so, here's what happens, is we point others to the one true living God. Listen, sometimes the greatest form of evangelism isn't always standing on a street corner with a microphone and a sign. It's just by the way we live our lives every day. Be consistent, be faithful, live a life of integrity, and when we do, other people will have to just notice. And who gets the glory? Not us. Don't look at me. I'm the tool, I'm the vessel. But the living God, living in and through me, is where all power, all glory, and all praise needs to be directed to. And we can see a movement of God just like this if we do the same thing. Would you pray with me? Father, we thank you for today.